crack my neck. Tommy Phillips, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you very much. Great. Really great to be here.
So you're a musician, and you live in this really cool house. You look really artistic. You got these cool glasses, great hair and beard, awesome house, and a musician. I'm just assuming like you're an artist, right?
Yes,
am I correct?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I'm a music freak, music nerd, and all my kids we're all into art and music. It's fun.
Okay, how does that like present itself in your life? You're like, I love music. Like, are you like one of those indie guys that are like, you've never heard of this band and you need to, or how's this look?
There are 3 occasions throughout the day where I put on a record for the fam, blast it real loud. In the morning when we're waking up.
You're vinyl.
Yeah, this morning it was Amadeus Phoenix, and last night we had some old, there's a band called Spiritualized. I think it was early 2000s. We were blasting that while we were playing Clue. So there's 3 times a day when I put records on just so we can like hear different styles, and it's something to talk about. And I don't know, we love a house full of music. So
it almost sounds like monastic, like the hours that we're keeping, but with like vinyl music. That's really cool.
Yeah, we love it.
That is sweet. Well, I want to know a little bit more about you. So what kind of soil did your life grow out of? What did that look like?
I was born in Los Angeles in 1980. My dad was a director of this worldwide sort of missions organization called Word of Life. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I have.
They have Bible institutes. They're in like a bunch, like 40-something countries.
Yeah.
But my dad ran Word of Life clubs on the West Coast. It was like youth groups that we would travel up and down from Seattle to Mexico, and he would like establish youth groups and stuff like that. And so I like grew up in like the parachurch thing. It was Southern Baptist theology. Eventually we moved to Tampa, Florida, where my dad took over the camp and like a Bible Institute. So just my whole life has been immersed in that. All day would have these gatherings for the college and the Bible Institute, and I would lead worship for them and play music and write music and all kinds of stuff. So that's like the soil I was raised in. Youth group. I loved youth group. I helped like establish a youth group at a local Brethren church when I was a kid. And me and my brother grew it from like 2 people to like 150 people. We just loved church culture. We loved it. It was, I spent my summers at summer camp, working at Christian camp, and it provided this sort of worldview where everything made sense. Mm. I knew why people spoke different languages. I knew why they were different colors. I knew like it was all there in the Bible. Until it like wasn't, you know what I mean? Yeah. Until suddenly you start seeing things and you're like, oh. Uh-huh. But yeah, I mean, I have great affection for it, the church, and a troubled relationship with it at this moment.
Yeah.
You know, so
you're currently a pastor of a church. Like, how did you find your way into that role as a pastor, and what kind of church are you overseeing right
now? I got hired. So I graduated from, actually went to Liberty University in 98 and graduated in 2002. So I was there during 9/11 and saw sort of this beginning of like this nationalist thing rising up, which we could talk about later if you want. But from there I graduated. I moved back to Tampa, and I was in a band. We were playing music, just a regular rock and roll kind of shoegaze band. And I got offered, someone called me up and said, hey, I heard you graduated from Liberty. We're looking for like a associate pastor, like a worship leader. And it was 2003. So I got hired by this church called Watermark Community Church. And I got hired there, and I got paid $50 a week. And I led worship and did youth. And then I was also managing a Starbucks, and I was playing music in a band. And so eventually, I don't really know how much of this. It's kind of one of those weird, difficult stories where you don't know how much to tell because you don't want to hurt people, but people did things that weren't right that I didn't know when I was 23. Mm-hmm. And you come to realize money's being misspent, and the adults are hiding things. And and a friend of mine sort of pulled me aside. He was serving as treasurer at the time. He's like, hey, there's some weird stuff going on. And so we went through, we found it was all kinds of shady stuff happening. And it sort of caused all the elders and the adults all to start fighting against each other. And I'm just 23, and I've invited all my friends, all my band friends. We're all in the church. Fast forward a year or two, everyone over the age of 30 had abandoned the church. The pastor had left. He had started writing for like an atheist magazine. He lost his faith entirely. That's probably what caused a lot of the things. He was deconstructing, couldn't tell anybody. I can look back now, I can see the process. But when I was 23, you just assume everyone's being evil. You know what I mean? Like when you grow up in a high control religious environment, you judge people pretty harshly, and you don't see all the things that are leading to what they went through. So I became a pastor through the church sort of being abandoned. And it was me and about 30 people around my age or younger than me, most of which were part of like a sort of punk rock subculture, and musicians and like vocational musicians, like did it for a living. And so we decided to keep going. And as long as we could pay the rent, we were meeting in this old theater, this old sort of theater, like Art Deco theater from like the 40s. My dad actually used to go there when he was a little kid. And so we were meeting in that building, and it's sort of, we were just trying to figure out how to be a church, because there are so many stories of people that were hurt in that group by the leadership that were just starting to be told. And so we decided, well, why don't we take a year or two and study the book of Acts, because we don't know what a church is. And I started leading through that, and we kind of grew onto about, eventually we grew to 150 people, and they were like, hey, well, how much are they paying you at Starbucks? And we'll pay you that. And so so that I became the full-time pastor, and that was 21 years ago now. And since then, I went back to seminary. I went to Northern, studied under McKnight. That's where I met him. Mm-hmm. But it has been, man, a journey. At first, we were sort of had Baptist theology, and that was, 2003 is when this new reform thing was picking up, and like, everyone was enamored by Mark Driscoll, not knowing where this was heading, and so we sort of went reformed, and then eventually that whole thing fell apart. Our theology sort of broke, and then we wandered for a long time trying to figure out what's real, who's telling the honest truth, we just started reading outside of our own tradition, a lot of us. At the time, the church was growing kind of rapidly. It at one point hit like 1,000 people before the pandemic, and we were about to launch a third service, and we were exhausted, but at the same time, we had all these questions that couldn't be answered. And so the pandemic for us was sort of this pause. We dealt with a lot of things. We laid all the questions out sort of on the table. Half the church left. And now we're at this small church that is sort of this hospital, I guess, if you will. Our church is called Watermark. We changed the name. We took off the community church thing, because usually Watermark, like community church, tends to mean like Stealth Baptist. You know what I mean? We just wanted to be like Watermark Church in Tampa. So we sort of became this place where, like, if you're deconstructing, you're moving out of out of evangelicalism, you spend some time with us. Mm-hmm. As like to see what's comfortable. Is this something I can keep going with? And we sort of help people work through these things. And then if you're just coming into Christianity, if you're just starting to hear about this guy Jesus and where you're to tend to be like your first stop. You know what I mean? And so there's this weird place in the middle where we're meeting everybody who's both becoming hopeless and becoming hopeful. We sort of hit the same spot. And so we've developed this liturgy over the years of gathering, where we gather in little circles around the room and serve each other physical bread and wine, look at each other, read some scripture together. And we've just developed this liturgy over the years to protect us from the division that we've experienced. It's just become a simple, humble little church, and I'm absolutely more in love with it than I've ever been. So,
wow,
it's been a wild journey.
That is, I mean, man, and you're still there after all of the ups and downs, and being there for 20 some years now. That's just fantastic.
These are my friends. I'm rooted here in this city. These are my friends. And I've made music with a lot of them. We actually, it's such a creative group. We've been writing music for years to sing at our own church. I've written 50 songs or so that we sing corporately. Wow. Worship, we record them. We have a studio upstairs and we record them, and there's other bands in the church that record there. And we're just trying to create, create life, create stories, create all that. And there's just a lot of our questions and our journey sort of put us sort of against our denomination sort of put us in disagreement with our denomination, so we had to deal with that over the last year, and we just separated from our denomination. And I don't have any hard feelings. We were Christian Missionary Alliance Church for a long, long time. I didn't know what the
Yeah.
Christian Missionary Alliance was when I got hired by the church.
Yeah.
And after the pastor left, I kind of was like, well, I guess we're a CMHer, so I went and got ordained. I didn't know anything about it. We never fit in, but we tried to honor them, and they tried to honor us. And at some point, you just have to admit what it is.
Yeah.
That it's not a fit.
Yeah.
So
I like that. A Stealth Baptist, though, community. I'm still laughing about that. Every time I see a community church, I'm be like, Stealth Baptist, Stealth Baptist.
That's what it is.
That's great. Well, it seems like you like tried on different paradigms. Let's try on the Southern Baptist-ish one. Let's try on the Reformed one. Let's try on, these different paradigms, and you're kind of wandering through. And, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we all like do that. We adopt a paradigm that seems to make sense almost pragmatically at the time. And we're like, well, this kind of works for now. I was a huge fan of Mark Driscoll back in the, mid 2000s or whatever that is. I was like, well, it works. He's edgy, he's biblical, he's honest, he's, and I was like, I like what he's doing. So I tried on the Reformed, did that for a while, and then you just notice like, it's almost like it's like a sweater that just doesn't fit. And you're like, I can't keep wearing this. And then you move on. Is that how you would kind of define deconstruction? Like the paradigms that you've kind of surrounded yourself with just don't seem to hold up to your lived experience, or how would you describe that?
For me, it's probably different for everyone. I can only speak from like my own experience and inside my own head. I started seeing patterns of what I interpreted as adults keeping information from me. You know what I mean? Like, I felt like not everyone was being honest. I was given the most, the strongest arguments for everything that from their side, but not the strongest arguments from the other side.
Yeah.
I remember I wrote about it in the book where I was sitting in I was sitting in the lobby sorry, I'm trying to get my thoughts together. Sitting in the lobby of a hospital or a doctor's office while my wife was getting a checkup on something, and I'm reading this National Geographic book, and it's explaining and showing evidence of these meteor strikes that were just insanely huge, so big that all life on Earth would be wiped out. You know what I mean? During the formation of things, and I believed the Earth was 8,000 years old, and there's no record of any of this, but it's obvious and right there. And that stuck with me. Like just one little article, I can see it. I don't remember necessarily the details of all it was saying, but I could see a picture of it in my brain. And I thought about it, and everywhere I went, I would begin to hear just these very futile sort of attempts to explain everything and these young earth creationist sort of ideas. But I had to keep my mouth shut, because anytime I saw anybody bring it up, they were pushed out real quick. And I'm a kid, I'm 24, I didn't have the authority to say, I think you're all lying, all of you middle-aged men with lots of letters behind your name. And there's just sort of came this moment where I no longer believed the general thought, like if they were lying about this, what else? And I began to see other things, and that some arguments weren't quite. The rapture thing started to fall apart, and I started reading more books, and every time you pick up a book to read about one thing, they drop 5 seeds of other ideas. And you're just like, what do I do with this? What do I do with this? And so you just, like the name of your podcast, you end up in this space, like liminal space. You're like, I feel alone here. I'm still a part of this huge group of people who all believe one thing, and they think I believe one thing, but I don't. And in fact, I think they are believing something because these other people are lying to them. I remember once I was at a museum, and there was this obvious, sort of homeschool co-op group walking through. I don't batch that. I homeschool my kids as well because there's stuff going on. But like the teacher, I watched her sort of get the kids in front of like a bunch of dinosaur bones, and then stand in front of the sign that said how old they were to cover it up and just tell a completely different story.
Wow.
And I don't think she was qualified to tell another story,
Mm-hmm.
But all the kids thought she was qualified to tell the other story.
Yeah.
And I realized, like, this is what's happening. All of us who
Yeah.
are my age are looking up at people who are telling a story that we have believed simply because of their age and their experience and their authority, and that they've led these huge organizations. But I began to see that many of them were sort of going along to get along, or they were just making stuff up so they could keep jobs. Or, I mean, Ken Ham was a family friend. Like, he would show up to like things at Word of Life and teach and talk, and I believed every word he said. Uh, and it sort of twists your brain to make you skeptical of everyone, and it carries on to this very day. I will. I don't think of myself as any kind of progressive, but I'm told that people describe you in different ways. But then sometimes they put this fear in you of these ideas and these types of people, and you meet them and you're like, oh, this guy's really, really progressive, but like, they believe everything I do, but I've been preconditioned as a child to judge them,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of like distance myself from them and not trust what they're saying, and then trust the people who now I know are lying to me, and it sticks with you your whole life. Like, you can't get rid of it, and so you have to like train your brain when you see somebody to push back against your initial impulses to judge them, and stop and say, no, that's what I was raised to do, and that's not what I'm gonna do. And in the midst of all of this, you're also trying to figure out, so what is true? What is real?
Mm-hmm.
And so we reordered our entire eschatology after COVID as a church. We started reading a lot of David Fitch. Are you familiar with his stuff at all?
Oh yeah.
The sort of three circles of ecclesiology. We decided that we needed a way of gathering that wasn't hierarchical. It was flat. It was space. It was open, where I could even ask questions and talk about my debts. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so we sort of switched our whole model of church, of how we do things, to sort of minimize power over structures and sort of share that
Yeah.
power with, power under other people. It's really been beautiful. We just created the space, and I feel like God's been really giving us this sort of peace that, like, all the things we worried about before, the money and the growth and the branding, blah, 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 literally none of it matters. And we're just trying to learn to become Christ-like and carry each other towards that without all the stumbling blocks that we throw in each other's way to walk to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll
Absolutely.
ramble all day.
That was a beautiful story. I did not want to interrupt the word of that. I was just like, wow, I was captivated with that. And because I grew up in a kind of a charismatic fundamentalist, so I had all the eschatology of rapture and end times and all the holiness stuff. What was like, your faith was you're not allowed to do all these things. Young earth creationism, homeschooled, like, and breaking out of that is, I think I started to question things like, the teachers of my Sunday school, as when I was a little kid, I look at them. I looked at them when I was a young adult, and I'm like, none of their marriages are great, and we were like the James Dobson adherers, and half of them ended bad, and they weren't. Even some were abusive, and I was just like, wait a second, this is not what I was told was going on when I was a kid. Like, here is the formula for healthy families. James Dobson has said it thus, and everyone adhered to it. Everyone taught it, believed it, and then put the face on like it was real in front of me.
Yes.
And then, 20 years after that, and it's like half of them couldn't keep the facade going, and, ended in divorces, and abuses were coming out. And I was just like, that is not what was shown to me, but it was what was taught to me. And it's just not real.
They don't want to admit that is a prosperity sort of God. The thing that they hate so much, prosperity gospel, that was purity culture. Mm-hmm. You do this, you do this, you do this. This plus this equals happy, healthy sex life forever. And I've never seen it work out. Mm-hmm. I have spent so much time meeting with people who were like, yeah, we We fought the urge to have sex for all of our dating years, and then we got married, and we had turned all the switches off and couldn't get it back on. This stuff damages. It sticks with people for a long time. And the amount of marriages I've seen trying to break free from the baggage of the fundamentalist purity culture that they were given, the shame, discomfort with their bodies, like all of that, it stays with people. You can't just change your mind because your entire structure of life was built around these particular ideas. I mean, this is why just deconstruction is so hard. People that aren't going through it can't see it. Like, you catch it. It's not something that you do. You read something you can't unread. You see something you can't unsee. You experience something that doesn't align with what you were promised. You watch people experience things, and there's no explanation for them. And then they're like, well, then what are the rules? And you're like, how do you answer that? Who told you there are rules? And what are, like,
Yeah.
how are we even in the face of this monument of like this thing that they built for us and said, this is the center thing. And that has crashed. And they're supporting people who have never lived, like political leaders who obviously don't live like this. They don't actually care as much as they say they do.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the end, you don't even know what to replace it with.
Yes.
And so you have parents in a church who are like, I don't know what to teach my kids. And so instead of looking for these rules anymore, we gather and we share a meal and we talk about the things we're scared of. We talk about wisdom. We offer each other guidance. We say, here's what I'm reading, here's what I'm doing. We pray. We ask the Spirit to join us and fill us with something, give us some sort. And what we begin to find is there is this grace amongst each other that, like, we understand it's not going to go like it did when we were kids. It may be better. It may be worse. But whatever happens, we around this table are raising our children together. And there is grace for each one of your children. There will be no judgment. And we will walk with them until they are healthy, flourishing humans.
I like that.
And we can celebrate their sex life, and we can celebrate what they have built. Instead of, here's a bunch of rules. If you don't have this, the band hammer comes down on you. You can't serve in leadership. You can't. You only need that when you're building a hierarchical church. In order to do that, it is necessary to find people who are the pristine model, statuesque people that you want to put on that stage, so you can point and be like, that's what we're after. That's what we're after. But that person doesn't exist. Yeah. And I don't know how long it's going to take us to realize that.
Yeah.
We keep platforming and giving power to people who are the pristine images of what we want, and they always turn out to be just like everyone else. What a shocker.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really like that story of the homeschooler teacher standing in front of the sign, showing off the dinosaur bones. Now, coincidentally, my wife and I have been home educating our kids, and we are part of a group that runs a inclusive homeschool co-op for all kids, because COVID made things a lot more. Home education is happening for non-religious reasons.
Yeah.
And so I was teaching astronomy in this class. I'm a science nerd. I love astronomy. It's like one of my favorite subjects, and I'm nerding out over all this stuff. We get to the one we're talking about the moon, and I'm like, where did the moon come from? And we still have some kind of religious fundamentalists with us, and they're like, well, God put it there. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? Like, God put it there. And the kid was just like, just put it there. I was like, okay, but this is a science class, and we need to talk about the science of how the moon got there. What do scientists say about how the moon got there? And the room was quiet, and you could just tell, like, this one or two individuals were coming from that young Earth creationist camp, and that the energy was just sucked out of the room. So I'm like, well, 4.5 billion years ago, a Mars-like planet crashed into Earth and caused all this, a thing, and one of them ended up in orbit, cooled down. And now it's this moon. And now the moon gives us tides, which gave us, and tide pools, which then creates RNA, which then leads to possible evolution of life coming out of it, all because we have a moon that gives us tide pools. And the looks on everyone's faces was just like, I don't know if we're allowed to be told this.
Isn't that weird that information would be bad?
I know. I was like,
That's
this
what
is
I
what
found.
scientists say. Yeah, information is dangerous,
I
and
I wrote about that. I wrote about.
fundamentalism. Sorry, you go. I'm
No,
interviewing you.
I read about having, like, in the book. I wrote about having a friend who was at Bible college, and he had to hide his Rob Bell Love Wins book inside of a John Piper dust cover
That's
and sit in
great.
the lobby and read this thing, making sure nobody picked it up and checked it because you weren't allowed to read things.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, they're not afraid. At that point, they're not afraid of liberalism. They're not afraid of anything else other than information. They're just afraid of
Hmm.
books. Um, and when you do that, you're just creating this side quest that everyone wants to go on. Why don't you want me to read that? We always want to read it. The thing that we're
Hmm.
human. That's the defining feature of human beings is curiosity about what I don't know, uh, and it plays right into it. So I don't know.
Yeah, and fundamentalism, like, it is about control, and you can't control all the information, so you have to build a smaller box that you can control, put other people in there, and say everything on the outside of this box is dangerous. Don't go there.
Yeah,
And that, yeah, I like what you say. Just like you can't unthink that. It's always a part of you, and you're always battling against that. And I think I'm a lot more comfortable than I have been, but I still find myself, we're going through the book of James at our church right now, and it's like,
mm,
boy, I gotta unlearn so much in order to teach this,
yeah,
because I learned a certain way to read these books, and it's a challenge. It is a
yeah.
challenge.
One of the stories I tell in the book is about a pastor I know who was pastoring a local church, and he was it was a fundamentalist church, and he didn't have a problem with that. He was fundamentalist, but they were asking. I mean, he was starting to ask some different questions and see some things he hadn't seen before. But then he was teaching through the book of First Timothy. He got to chapter 2, and then he's working through that part that talks about how women are to be silent in the church, and he didn't have a particular problem with that. He reads that, he's like, well, that's normal complementarian theology, and he gets to the next part, and it's like, and women will be saved through childbirth,
Hmm.
and he's just like, no time was spent on this passage in seminary. So he has no idea what to do with it.
Hmm.
Uh, and so he's like, I know I took all the verses before it literally, but there's no way that a woman has to give birth in order to, as he understands it, go to heaven. So, like, he starts studying and reading. He reads about the Temple of Artemis. He reads about the worship of the way they were worshiping with these elaborate hairstyles and all this stuff. And he realizes that Paul is actually speaking about some very specific women who were part of this temple worship and disruptions happening in the church, but he's not silencing women everywhere. And when he presents this to this church, he gets fired. So, like, you can't have a pastor reading and
Hmm.
learning and growing in a fundamentalist
Yeah.
church. You just can't.
Yeah.
Um, it's a danger. And I remember early on when I was early on in the church, I was asking my elder board a decade and a half ago, hey, I think I should take more seminary classes, and they were just kind of like, no, please don't. It was discouraged. They're not elders. Elders now are very supportive. They actually helped me go to seminary at Northern, but, like, there was a time when I recognized these people are terrified of information. They're terrified of
Mm.
learning, terrified of looking outside of their own circle. But if that's true, how can you ever understand what Jesus is doing out there, what the Spirit's doing,
Hmm.
what the ministries that are happening, the places where God is bringing reconciliation, and you could have a part in that. But instead, we kind of look at it and push it away as like this secular, awful thing. But God is doing it, and so we just can't see outside of our own space.
Yeah. I remember in 2011, the church I was at, I was an associate pastor, going through a lot of stuff, and women in leadership was a controversial thing. We never said that they could be, but it just historically was allowed. And they were searching for a lead pastor, and no lead pastor would talk to us because we were
Mm.
searching in all of these complementarian sites. And they're like, well, you have women on your elder board. I can't talk to you.
Yeah,
And so the church was like, well, then we need to look at this. And the Bible says, they go to the Timothy passage. And I was very much on the egalitarian side. I was trying to explain to this elder in the church, like the Artemis part of, that whole
yeah,
Second Timothy passage.
it's
And
complicated.
he looked at me he literally looked at me and he's like, well, if we have to take that verse in context, what other verses do we got to keep read in context?
That's a good question.
And I just
That's
looked at him with a good dumbfounded. I'm like, all of them. I was just
all
like,
of it.
all of them. He just could not fathom that there was a context for these passages. And I'll never
Yeah.
forget the look on his face. Like what? Well, what other ones do we got to read in context? And I'm like, every
Yeah.
single one.
But dude, I mean, I feel like it's happening. Like the church is beginning to break free
Mm-hmm.
of this sort of bondage it's been in for so
Yeah.
long. I feel it. Like I have conversations every week with different people who are like, I grew up in the church. I left the church a decade ago. And then they're showing up at Watermark and hanging out talking about Jesus and asking questions about Jesus because they're interested. People want to follow somebody. They're like, oh, I went and studied Buddhism. I studied this and this and this and this and this. I keep coming back to Jesus. And they ask questions about his teaching. It's almost like at first they want to hear it without all the miraculous stuff and the divinity and stuff. They want to hear the message of Jesus. And what I've noticed is as you give it to them, as you walk with them for an extended period of time, things just naturally begin to shift in how they view the text. And all these things that they had thrown out begin to come back in completely different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to a guy who was like, the Apostles' Creed used to be for me, or the Nicene Creed, whatever, used to be this sort of like separation, like, if you don't believe this, you can't be a part of it. But I don't see it like that. Now I see it as like this unifying thing that despite all of our differences, this thing helps me reach across all of our differences and grab. Because deconstruction is sort of this rewiring of how you look at everything. And so these things that once meant something, you'll throw them out. You'll go back. You pick them back up. Be like, I thought this meant that, and it doesn't mean that. It means this. And so I see these shifts and these changes happening in people's lives, and it's almost like they're reconverting in a completely different way. They're using the same language, but it doesn't mean the same thing. They're talking about the way of Christ, but it's no longer like this way to some Gnostic flyaway, spirit thing. It is how I, as a human being, am designed to flourish and bring flourishing to the people around me, and how Jesus has revealed all of this to me. And it puts like this root in their life instead of just this afterthought thing where like, oh, I'm saved.
Mm.
No, it's like I am being saved, and I am bringing salvation as well.
Yeah.
As I walk with these people through life, and it's very different.
Yeah.
Something's happening.
I like what Thomas Merton said, that every monk needs 2 conversions, one to get him in the monastery, one to keep him there. And
Yeah.
it's always stuck with me. He's like, and maybe a few more. It's like, and I'm like, I am wondering, like, deconstruction is seen from the people who hold the power or want the structure to remain the same as a threat. And
Yes.
you've kind of written that 86% of the people who go through deconstruction end up staying in the church, in the faith, but recentering on Jesus. What are you finding that deconstruction process, reconversion process, is nudging out of the center to put Jesus there? Because if Jesus wasn't at the center, then what was?
I think before, I think what is being nudged out, let me think about this for a second, is this sort of Christendom tribalist, I'm on this winning team and we're going to battle evil in the world and all that. Sort of this hierarchical thing where like this is, I don't know, it's hard to describe, man. That was good question, what we're knocking off, because I can see it in my brain and it's all connected. This system of like being certain and understanding from beginning to end everything that is possibly wrong with the universe and having all the answers. And it basically fills us. I think it's power. I think that's what we're pushing off. As I talk about it more and more, I really think it comes down to the fact that we want to walk into a place with power. I have the answers for you. Oh, you're poor. I'm gonna enter into your situation. Are you in need? I'm gonna enter into your situation. I've got the money. I'm upper middle class. I've got all the information you need. I know exactly what's wrong, and I can solve it for you with all of my power, and then I can also give you the answer to all of life's biggest, deepest questions. But what that's being replaced with is a life of virtue. That there's sort of this shift in Christianity happening where, from what I see, the image of Christianity is shifting from a religion of laws to a religion of virtues, to where it is about the kind of person we become. And that the power of God is not released in having more earthly power, like this power of Babylon. We've been going through the book of Revelation for the last year in our church. I figure it's the perfect year to do that. There's this way that when I look back at like the Mark Driscoll days, when I was like into that stuff, and you're like, he's just powerful. Look at all he's doing for God. And how does he do it? He amasses wealth and a large voice and influence and followers and a stage and money. And this is impressive because we've been discipled in the ways of America. It's impressive. But the more we are discipled in the ways of Jesus, the less impressive that all is. That's just power, 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 power. It's not Christ-like power. Christ-like power, the power of God, Jesus revealed to us, is only released on the cross. And so cross-shaped acts, as Michael Gorman would say in his book Cruciformity, cross-shaped acts that where we give of ourselves and have ourselves like broken and poured out for other people, so that they can live, so that they can find healing, so that they can find restoration. That is how the power of God is released. This is the entirety of the message of the cross. This is when I act in ways that are shaped and formed by the cross of Jesus. So the power which, he has everything. He has all that Mark Driscoll power. He gives it all up to become the nobody, the wandering traveling healer. Who speaks out against the empire, knowing full well everyone who does this gets crucified, tells his people, I'm going to the cross. Peter's like, no, you're not. You're going to the top. And he's like, and then he calls him Satan. He turns to Peter, like, well, now you sound like Satan. That's Babylon. That's not how God fixes the world. And so we have been discipled by America and by the American church to believe that God will work when we gain power, when we form everything, when we get to the seats of power, when we have all the money, the financial guru, live like no one else now so that you can live and give like no one else. You know what I mean? Like, when I get Babylon's power, I'm going to use it for the ends of Jesus, believing that somehow God will work through this. But Jesus has revealed to us that God does not work in that way. That is not how God fixes anything, and never has. And so we are reaching in vain. We are grasping at things that are unattainable when we live this way. And what is being knocked off that pedestal is Babylon's power, and what is being replaced is Christ's power. The power to give up all of Babylon's power and to gather people who are your enemies, who are not in the same social class as you, who hate you, or who love you, or who misunderstand you, sometimes purposely, and you gather them all together, and you discern life together around the table, making sure everyone's needs are taken care of at that spot, feeding them the meal, talking about the bread and the wine, retelling the story of this man, Jesus. That like what we see with Jesus gathering these people together, this is how the power of God is released, and it creates this body of people who, when they live this way sacrificially, other people are healed and restored, and that brings more in. And honestly, part of the work that needs to happen so that this can continue is deconstruction. We have to deconstruct how we move through this world, and look what is the book ends sort of with this question of like, hey, whose hand is the church holding? I use the description of like George Bush holding the Prince of Saudi Arabia's hand publicly. For us, it's kind of awkward to see him do that. For them, it was this symbol of like togetherness and like, we're with you, we're on the same path. Look at the church. Whose hands are we courting? Like, who is the church really trying to get in bed, as the saying goes? With who? Not the people Jesus was courting. Not at all. And I think that's very telling. And the deconstructors that come to me, that I talk to, and that Scott has talked to. They look at how the church is acting. They look at whose approval we're after. They look at our structures and how we're doing things and how we're wielding power. And they look at it and they say, that looks nothing like Jesus. I don't see any of Jesus in here. I see all the other characters from the text. I see Joshua and David and Paul. I see everybody. I don't see Jesus. It's like you're using all these other people to silence what Jesus was saying, instead of reading them and understanding them and their actions through whether or not they were Christ-like or not. Is this what God was intending to do? And I don't know. I'll ramble all day on that. I don't want to get stuck on one question.
Well, you captured my attention again. I like what you said. Who are we courting? And I've taken up a phrase that it's one of my catchphrases that I just kind of use, and I say it in sermons quite a bit. I'm like, how you get something shapes you into the person who then has that thing. So you can't pursue power according to how the world uses power, and then say you're going to use it for God on the other side, because that pursuit of the power is going to shape you into a person who pursues power for the sake of power.
Yep.
And then you convince yourself you'll do it for good, but it doesn't.
We have a chapter called, so a lot of the solutions that we offer for churches trying to understand why people are leaving, as we help people sort of turn inside and look introspectively at your gathering, at your structures, at your theology. The solution that we offered up is the I am statements of Jesus. That was my master's thesis at Northern Seminary, was on the I am statements of Jesus. I wrote that and turned it into Scott. And when I went to seminary originally, I was really deconstructing hard. I admitted at one point in class, I was like, I have preached sermons where I couldn't say what I believe or what is. Instead, I had to refer to, well, the early Christians taught this, because I wasn't sure if I believed it. And these are moments where, like, you're deep in struggle, but you keep moving forward. And he asked me, like, so why did you continue preaching? Because I was terrified. Absolutely terrified. I didn't know what to do. My whole life had been this. I know the Bible, but I was struggling to make sense of its weight, of its authority, and like what that even meant, because I had given this picture of authority. But anyways, what you just said, there's this part in the book where we talk about Jesus says he's the door, and he's what you're looking for when you walk in the door. And I had this pastor pull me aside when I first became a pastor, old retired pastor who actually finished it very well, and he told me, hey, what you save people with is what you're saving them to. And it didn't really make a lot of sense to me, but later on I began to realize what he was saying as I saw people grow their church based upon power, based upon fancy sneakers, cool sound systems, logos, branding, music, all of the things of Babylon. And we bring people in and we tell them all of this is from God. All of this amazingness that you are drawn to and attracted to, how beautiful we are, how perfect our marriages are, our families, blah, blah, blah. It's all from God, and we got there by doing this. And then they enter in and they don't receive any of these things, and then they walk away because you drew them in with whatever this thing was, sort of promising it to them. Like purity culture. And when your marriage falls apart because it's been so damaged by the thing that you did to follow God that destroyed your actual sexual health in your life and your marriage, you realize that like what drew you in was that. It was a self-help exercise. When what we should be drawing people in with is the story of Jesus of Nazareth. This man, and what he said, what he did, how he responded, his presence among people, who he gathered with, who he held hands with, how he responded when he's being literally killed for speaking the truth. And all that God did through him. This is the story that we come and tell. And when you draw people in with the story, you're bringing them to the story, which becomes the center of their life. If you make it about preachers and sneakers kind of stuff, they're really drawn in. They're like, yo, we're going to make God cool, and we're going to make God attractive, and all this stuff. None of this has anything to do with Jesus. If anything, it's the opposite of what Jesus was doing. And when you gather people in those ways, you're gathering people towards Babylon. And then when Jesus actually shows up, they don't want it. They reject it. It's not interesting anymore because it doesn't give you any of the things that discipleship in Babylon has promised you would receive.
Yeah.
But there are so many other things. And when you begin to talk about the cultivation of the fruits of the Spirit, who doesn't want to experience love and joy and peace, patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control? Like, who doesn't want these virtues and these traits growing in your life? What would it look like? What kind of ministry would that be to your family if this was your posture? How would it affect your community if you were a Christ-like person? We are told over and over again in the text, it draws people in. Always be ready to talk. They're going to see it in you. Like, you're different. And when I was a kid, I used to hear that and be like, you're different. And they would know you're different because you wore like a pro-life t-shirt, or you voted a certain way, or you stood up. I literally saw one of the guys in my Bible college stand up in the middle of a Chili's and pray loudly for his dinner for everyone to hear.
Yeah.
And the other students were so impressed. Where, it's going back to the other thing. It's power we're pulling off the pedestal. And it's the power of Christ that we're putting on the pedestal, which is very different.
Yeah. I think that whole, you're going to be different and people will notice, we're taught that means you're going to look almost extraterrestrial, extra spiritual, otherworldly. Yes. And so you're just going to be so oddball that people are going to be like, huh? And now that
you're describing the Amish. That's what we're describing. They're doing it. Like that thing that you want, they're doing it.
Yeah. Well, now when I do a funeral, I will do one prayer, and I barely mention scriptures or anything because most of the people that the funeral homes ask me to do funerals for are not religious.
Yeah.
And every single time they're like, "You're a pastor?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm a pastor." "What church do you pastor? Because I think I might want to check that out." And it's my weirdness now is that I'm not so otherworldly, but I'm so human that fundamentalists accuse me of secular humanism. And I'm just
yes.
No, our God became human. And so our faith should look very human. And we're so good at being human that we should look so different. And not that otherworldly superimpose some extraterrestrial spirituality over top of our life so that we look weird. Yeah. We should be so human that it's just well, the other humans are so fearful and anxious and addicted to power. And then there's you, you're doing things different and weird. I like that aspect of things, that they're going to notice that you're odd. But not necessarily.
The oddness should stem from in an empire that centers on making enemies and dividing people. The weirdness should be, there's a bunch of people running around bringing everybody back together.
Yeah.
Paul tells us literally the mission of God is reconciliation. And he has given the church that ministry. And so we've made that at Watermark the center of what we're doing, because we're pursuing Christ-likeness and wisdom and reconciliation as far as we can right now. We're trying to find a new way. We don't see the church traveling down the same path as it has been for the last 100 years.
Yeah.
We want to be a part of. We want to build that new thing, man.
Well, it's really hard to wrap capitalism around that and build the thing that pays your bills as a pastor. So you're and then the people who are experiencing the thing that you have built and wrapped in capitalism, it's when they hit those modes of deconstruction, they're it doesn't feel real anymore. I sing the songs, I hear the sermons, I go through the motions, I attend the programs, and it just doesn't feel real anymore. And I think it's because, we've just taken a fancy program, wrapped it in capitalism, and put a Christian t-shirt on it and called it church. I think what you're doing down there in Florida is more that communal-oriented way of being together, wrapped, centering around the person and work and ways of Jesus. I think it's cool.
Yeah. There's got to be something. There's got to be a better way than what we were given. There has to. Just try to find it.
Yeah. So, what is the role of what's the? I'll say it this way: how do we differentiate between doubt and curiosity? And what do you think their roles, respectively, are in the deconstruction reconstruction
Hmm.
plan? Doubt and curiosity.
I mean, both belong. Doubt, uh, it will always be there with you. I think the creating anxiety around people's doubts is has been one of the features of my life growing up. Um, kind of told if you're having doubts, it's because you're not having faith.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's very shame based. Fills you with a lot of shame, uh, and it stifles your curiosity. You're not allowed to be curious. You're not allowed to poke at stuff. You're not allowed to ask questions about like, so a loving God, eternal conscious torment. Go. You know what I mean? Like how? And I just I wanted adults to talk to me about it,
Mm-hmm.
and they could not. It's not that they wouldn't; they couldn't because they all had lives as well. Because again, capitalism rules all. We have to have the money coming in. We have structured the world and our country in such a way that curiosity is dangerous
Mm.
to people of faith. Um, and I really think it's really healthy for people to sit in a room, read something, sit around the table, share a meal, read the text, and find something that you're like, well, that's harsh. What Jesus said to this woman here about the dogs from the table and blah, blah. Like that's harsh. It doesn't sound nice. And from where I'm at, it doesn't seem loving. Well, then let's dive in. That's a great like I never would have asked these questions. I would have just said, whatever Jesus did was justified. He's Jesus. Like it doesn't matter. Um, uh, all the babies that were slaughtered, it's God. That's his prerogative. They're not. I have no control over any of this. He must have known something I don't, and that's what the whole thing settled on. Is they must have known something that I don't. But really, what I subconsciously I think thought was these people who are in charge know something that I don't, and so you trust everything that they say. Um, but when you actually allow people to be curious, and you allow people and you encourage it, and you tell people, hey, um, what doesn't line up, what doesn't add up. I do this with my kids. What are you doubting about what you've been taught? I want to hear that because I want to doubt it too. Because if you can doubt it, then you can sift through it and be like, oh, it's actually a lot more important. That thing can come back to you in a new way, or it can be jettisoned for a healthier life.
Mm.
But everything should be understood. There's this. I love the way that Gregory Boyd in his book Cross Vision talks about like I would read the violent passages of God, and it didn't make any sense. And he sort of tells a story about his wife, seeing his wife across the street. It's not a real story. He sort of makes it up. He's like, suppose I saw my wife of 37 years kick a homeless man and push him over and take his money and run away. Like, I know her. That's not her. I know her. How am I supposed to think about this? What am I supposed to make of this? And he goes, there must be something else going on. Is this a YouTube prank? Did the guy attack her? Is there something? What's going on? And he sort of encourages us, like, hey, let's back up. Like, the things that you see, don't just take them and incorporate them in. Ask questions. Like, God is like Jesus. That Jesus has revealed the face of God. Hebrews 1, John 1, like, the fullness, the full expression. Like, if you want to know what God is like, you look at Jesus. And so we're not called to take all of Scripture and look at the whole thing and form this nebulous idea of God and then say, Jesus is that. Instead, we look at Jesus to form our understanding of who God is, and we ask questions about the rest. Why did they think this? Why did they think this? When I was younger, I couldn't understand how, because now my understanding now, and this shifts and stuff here and there, my understanding now is that like they're looking at God in the Old Testament the same way other people are looking at different gods. They had this cultural context and they're trying to understand, and so they assumed God is violent. And it's I look at this now and I look back and I say, where I didn't used to understand how you could misunderstand who God is, because we have Jesus now. How could you think God is like that? What kind of people would wrap their lives around these kind of stories? But I look at what Christianity has become in America today, and I say, oh, I actually do see how you could wrap your whole life up in this picture of God that is not look like Jesus at all. And it was so hard for me to understand how they could misunderstand things. And I look at, we are misunderstanding things, and I realize, oh, we're all misunderstanding things. You have to come back to Christ at the very center every time and build your understanding of who God is by looking at Jesus, how he interacts with people. That this is a picture of the divine. You want to follow the divine? Follow in the way of Jesus. Understand how he loves people. Love people this way. Learn to love people this way.
It seems like if we were just taught that, it'd be so much easier than that big nebulous. And it's like all of these things from the Bible, which are cherry-picked, hand-selected. We're going to ignore that. We don't even know what to do with that. Don't bother with that. Like the things that a lot of the fundamentalists criticize, the deconstruction community of, they do themselves, but they can't see the parts that they're leaving out. So they make that big nebulous of cherry-picked, hand-picked things that support up what they already know and believe. And, I wrote a little piece for Thomas Ord's book coming out about amipotence, which and he's like, I want people to write essays about them, and then I'll write a response. And he asked me to write an essay, so I did. And I opened up with Tozer's quote about what you believe about God is the most important thing about you. And it's like, if you believe that God is this all-powerful being that can use violence, then you can also become a person who has a lot of power and uses that violently against other people, because, God does that. So it's okay that we do that too. And it's like, that nebulous idea, you gave me a picture. I don't think I'm going to forget. That's not God, but Jesus is God. And then everything else you ask the questions about. That was a really powerful visual for me.
I was raised, I was taught like, hey, you should study King David. He was a man after God's own heart. And you look at King David, and I studied him, but David is not Christ-like many, many times in his life. And so I'm teaching my kids that God is not like David. Understand David. Read David. And there are moments where you could see Christ-likeness shining through in the life of David. Here and there. It's a glimmer. It's a piece. That's why the writer of Hebrews starts off and says, in the past we saw sort of, the Greek would be like fragments and fashions. Like we saw God in little bits and pieces. The prophets coming in from the wilderness and saying something, and we see God in these little bits, and we're sort of putting it together, and like we look at our history, it's a historiography, and we're coming up with this picture of who God is based upon what we've all been through and the little bits and pieces we found. But Hebrews tells us now we have Jesus. We can brush the whole, the way McKnight wrote it in the book, we can brush the whole puzzle right off the table and look clear at the full image of Jesus. And be like, this is what this was heading towards. This is what God is like. This is what humans are called to be like. This is the center of everything. And the center of the Christian gathering should always be becoming Christ-like, cultivating the fruits of the Spirit. That's it. When we do this, we're creating a people whose lives, whose body is willing to be broken and poured out so that others can live and can find healing. And like, this is perpetuating the image and the picture of Jesus that brings more people in, who then learn to follow Jesus as well. And over time, they begin to see all these other theological things that grow and grow and grow, and their lives become cross-shaped and cruciform, and they begin to do that, and the church begins to spread. It has nothing to do with power. It has nothing to do with me charging it and telling you the truth and arguing. Like nobody should ever become a Christian because they lost an argument. Like this is not how Christianity works.
Man, that was memeable. I became a Christian because I lost an argument. Like, good Lord, that's a good one.
I don't think it's mine. It's a term we've thrown around a lot. Oh, you lost an argument, now you're a Christian, huh?
Well, as you look around, there's a lot of deconstruction happening. There's a lot of doubling down of fundamentalists tying to Republican authoritarian politicians. We're at this apocalyptic moment where a lot of new growth is coming out. A lot of old growth is refusing to die. What is giving you hope in this moment as a really difficult liminal season that we find ourselves in as a nation, as a people, as a faith.
Honestly, what's given me the most hope is the honesty with which the Christian and right has been displaying themselves for the last few years.
Mm.
I feel like it's the first time everyone has felt free. Progressives, conservatives, has felt free to truly be the full embodiment of their theological construct. And we can now see and look and be like, that is wildly unhealthy, which means it is rooted in bad theology. Because good theology makes you Christ-like. And the more un-Christ-like these Christian leaders become, all over the world, every week, I have a habit of, I'm on Threads, and every time, was it Julie Royce posts another scandal, I just comment every single week, and it's every single week. And the longer this goes on, actually, the more hopeful I become, because it all needs to be shown. The light needs to be shown on all of it. And we finally have to come to an understanding and an admission and a confession that this is not what was ever intended. This display of piety and power and sheer greed and competition and wanting little pats on the head by very powerful people in the empires in which we live. All of this is going to, like, whenever you see, I mean, David Fitch sort of taught me that, like, whenever you see these uproars, whenever you see these moments of just chaos, that means God is working. He's dragged something into the light, and we see it, and now the work can begin. And the work couldn't begin until then, and now it can. And so whenever I see people come to me and are like, "Look, did you see what happened? It's awful." My response is, "Oh, God is working. Things are being uprooted and thrown out and changing, and He's working from the bottom up, and it's fascinating." And so, I think I lost actually the question you were asking at this point.
No, you hit the bullseye. You hit the bullseye, and you have given a different paradigm to see the shit show that is American religion and politics. And you're like, oh, good, it's drug into the light. Now we can do something about it. Now we can see it for what it is. Because when I was a kid and a teenager, it was in the darkness. We couldn't see it. And now it's being drug out into the light and be like, look at all of this, this is garbage. This is rooted in bad theology, and it's bad living. And
it's like we can finally pull the veil down and just show them, this is what you've been following. Shall we go that way? Any other way? Shall we try it? And so when I teach a Watermark 101 class, like for people coming to the church and joining the church, and I explain our ecclesiology, like, we used to do this and it failed. Now we do this and we think it will work, but it might fail. And if it does, we're going to try again. I'm not approaching this whole thing as like, here's what we've figured out. You know what I mean? Like, and everybody should do this. No, like, we're a unique group of people doing a unique thing, and every group everywhere is a unique group doing a unique thing. We don't know what God is doing everywhere. We have found for right now what God wants us to do, and we're doing that. And we're finding some health. And so we'll keep going. I don't have a 5-year plan.
Well, I love it. I've loved this conversation. You've given me so many great visuals and pictures and perspectives. That's just, you've added to the bank of stuff that I've learned. Like, I've learned more on doing this podcast. I've learned more than when I did my doctorate degree. It's just been,
I would imagine.
I was just like, teach me something, please. I need to learn more. I've found so many blind spots, and I just need to learn more. And you have been one of my teachers, so thank you.
I was listening to when I was listening to your interview with Matt Tebby, and we were in the car driving with my wife, and I was like, yeah, I'm supposed to talk to this guy like next week. And these guys are so smart, and I'm really nervous. Because the more you know, like, I genuinely feel like I don't know anything most of the time. And you talk to other people, and they're like, I didn't know all that. I'm like, really? And you say something they didn't know. It's great.
Yeah. Well, you've got this perspective, and you're just digging in, and you're a practitioner. I mean, you've got education, but you're a practitioner, and you're honest, you're authentic, and you're creative, and that is its own brilliance beyond academia.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
So thank you for being on the show. I've loved this
Yeah.
conversation. It's been great.
Yeah. I haven't even mentioned the book yet.
Oh
It's
yeah,
called
where do you
Invisible
want to send
Jesus.
people? Where do you want to send people to buy the book? I was supposed to ask that.
So yeah, I don't have a particular place to send people. I'm not a big fan of Amazon, but if you know, I'm not here to have power over you. So yeah, the book is called Invisible Jesus. The subtitle is a book about leaving the church and looking for Christ, and it's about just that: people leaving the church. Because the more they're in the church, they become less and less Christ-like, and they actually want to become more loving and more good and more faithful people. And the church is hindering that. And so we have a lot of stories. We have some research in there, and a big sort of most of my thesis on the I am statements of Jesus is in there. Yeah, it's just opportunity of a lifetime. It's been great.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to put a link to the IVP direct so they can get it right direct from the publisher. I'll put that down in the show notes. Do you have a website or social media that you want to direct people towards, or your church site?
So, yeah, the church is called Watermark Tampa, watermarktampa.com. I've been writing and blogging my way through the book of Revelation. So, Tommy Priest and Phillips.substack. I have a Substack there. And I've been writing about the book as well. I'll probably write a lot more about the book. I'm trying to gather some more stories and publish some of those, and some of the stuff we couldn't fit in the book. So yeah, and of course McKnight has a very active, really good Substack. So check him out as well, Scott McKnight. One T in Scott.
You co-wrote that book with him. So
yes.
I forgot that he was a part of this.
Oh, yeah.
We've just had a good conversation, just me and you. But he did co-write some of this book also. With you, so
he did. Yep. That's great. Yeah, I grew up reading him. Like he was one of the people that, like, fresh out of college, I started reading, that started like pulling the rug out from under some stuff.
Yeah, Blue Parakeet knocked me off.
And it's been awesome. Just I met him at Northern and built up a friendship, and then this book sort of came out of that, and it's been awesome.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna put all those links in the show notes so people can just click on them. We'll take them right to all your places. And Tommy, thank you so much for coming on and just sharing your heart, your wisdom, and your knowledge. It's been great.
Yeah. Oh, last thing. I write sort of some dissident worship music.
Yes.
It's under the name Priest and Phillips, and it's on all the streaming stuff, Spotify and Apple Music and YouTube and everything. But it's Preson. It's like Preston without a T. Priest and Phillips. All right. And if you're in Tampa, we're playing Janice Landing with Under Oath on December 15th. So come out to that.
I want to put your music down in the notes too, because I want to check that out. I want to check it out.
Cool.